I first of all want to say that I am immensely happy to have had the opportunity to travel again to Australia. It has been approximately 3.5 years since I last made this trip. I must say that a significant amount of my political activity in the course of my now pretty long political career, I have traveled frequently to Australia. The first time in 1977, when I was just 27 years old, I came to Australia to give lectures on security in the Fourth International, which dealt with the initial findings of the International Committee's investigation into the assassination of Leon Trotsky. And so I gave lectures in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, and Brisbane. It was an unforgettable experience and very important because it established direct relations with the cadre of what was then the Socialist Labor League, which proved to be enormously important when the crisis erupted in the International Committee. The next time I came to Australia was actually 9 years later, in 1986, when in the aftermath of the split, when the International Committee was reworking and working through the implications of that really critical and decisive struggle, a struggle which secured the survival of the Trotskyist movement and laid the basis for its enormous political development over the last now 38 years. Tonight I'm going to be speaking about a book which has been published by Mehring, Leon Trotsky, and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century. This is a book which includes essays that have been written over a period of 41 years. The first set of essays were written in the autumn of 1982. The last set of articles that appear in this volume have been written this year. Some of them, actually the last one just a month or two ago. What is striking, looking back on the works in this volume, is the interconnectedness. I must say that while the analysis has developed, the underlying theme of all the essays or lectures and even a letter that appear in this volume is that in the perspective of history, Leon Trotsky emerges as the decisive figure in the socialism of the 20th century and in the socialist movement of the 21st century. Now, there is no question that the two great figures of socialism in the 20th century are, of course, Lenin, the founder of the Bolshevik Party, and Trotsky. And it isn't my intention in that sense to compare one to the other, who was greater. That is not really the issue. Both of these gigantic figures, their role was determined, as it always is, by the historical circumstances in which they live. As Marx had famously said, men make history, but not of conditions of their own choosing. When we speak of Lenin and Trotsky, of course, we are aware of the differences in the trajectory of their careers dictated by one gigantic fact. Lenin died in 1924. Trotsky lived until 1940. And the period between 1924 and 1940 proved to be of monumental significance for the fate of world socialism. In 1935, Trotsky maintained a diary, which I think was published in 1958. It became known, it was published under the title Diary in Exile. Trotsky explained that he was not one really who often used the diary form, but he found himself in peculiar conditions in which this genre provided an opportunity for him to deal with questions which to sort of engage in almost an internal dialogue with himself and ponder political questions. It's a fascinating and brilliant document. But one of the interesting, or perhaps the most significant passage in that book is when Trotsky raises the question of his role in history. And Trotsky thinks of two major events in his life. The first, of course, is the fact that Trotsky was the organizer, unquestionably, of the October Revolution itself. The role that Trotsky played in the victory of the Bolshevik Party, in the victory of the insurrection, and subsequently the victory of the Red Army over the counter-revolution was of monumental significance. I think it was once Lenin said, talking about Trotsky, and said, who else could build a model army? Who else could do what Trotsky has done? And Trotsky was, of course, rightly, and not in a egotistical or egomaniacal sense, Trotsky was aware and proud of the role he had played in that revolution, or shouldn't he be? But he said that he still believed that even without him, there is the possibility that the revolution could have succeeded. He said it would not have succeeded without Lenin. And that was for very specific political reasons related to Lenin's astonishing authority in the Bolshevik Party itself. So without Lenin, it is doubtful that he himself could have overcome resistance within the Bolshevik Party to the taking of power. And indeed, the turn by Lenin to Trotsky, and Trotsky's rapid elevation into the leadership of the Bolshevik Party was only possible because Lenin had come to accept the correctness of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, his evaluation of the nature of the bourgeois democratic revolution in the 20th century, country with a belated capitalist development, the socialist revolution, the bourgeois democratic revolution could only be completed in the form of a socialist revolution. So while Trotsky recognized his obviously very important role in 1917, he said, I don't think it was indispensable. He said, however, my role today is indispensable. No other person is in a position to maintain the continuity of the Marxist movement. And what did he mean by that? In the aftermath of the death of Lenin, or even as Lenin was dying, a conflict had erupted inside the Bolshevik Party, which over time revealed itself to be a struggle between different social forces over the most fundamental question of perspective. The Stalinist faction, which first emerged or began to emerge in 1923, 24, and then articulated the theory of Stalin and Bukharin, the theory of socialism in one country, set into motion a process of bureaucratic and nationalist counter-revolution against the perspective of October. Trotsky, and in the autumn of this year, we will begin to observe formally the centenary of the founding of the Trotskyist movement. Trotsky played the seminal and central role in the development of an organized political opposition to this process of Stalinist degeneration. And all the great questions which emerged in the aftermath of 1923, in which great struggles were to decide the fate of socialism for the rest of the century, were fought out. The British general strike of 1926, betrayed by the policies of the British Communist Party, carried out at the behest of the Soviet bureaucracy. The defeat of the Chinese Revolution in 1927, the direct product of the subordination of the Communist Party to the bourgeois regime, the bourgeois government movement, party of the Kuomintang led by Chiang Kai-shek. Most devastating of all, the defeat of the German proletariat by Hitler as a consequence of the policies of social fascism imposed upon the German Communist Party by the Stalinists, and the subsequent betrayals of social revolution throughout Europe and internationally under the banner of the Popular Front. Added to that, the criminal massacre, annihilation of virtually all remnants of the Bolshevik Party or its revolutionary generation by the Stalinist regime. Trotsky was, the writings of Trotsky was the Marxist response to these betrayals. He subjected all of these events to the most careful, critical analysis, and on that basis, he laid the basis politically for the establishment of the Fourth International, which he first called for 90 years ago in the aftermath of the defeat of the German working class by Hitler, and then carried to its organizational completion in 1938, 85 years ago, with the formal founding of the Fourth International. This is important to stress, and the point that I know I've made many times in lectures and in articles is that when we think of Trotsky's role and the extraordinary contribution that he made to the development of Marxism, what one is struck by more than anything else is the staggeringly contemporary character of his work. More than any other Marxist, and even Lenin, and that is not to say that there is not immense relevance, indeed there is, in what Lenin writes, but the political problems which we deal with are so profoundly connected to Trotsky's analysis. They're really, yes, it's true, the world moves on and things change, but perhaps with justifiable exaggeration. I have sometimes, in discussing a political situation or to illustrate the point, have said, you know, if Trotsky were to walk into this room and say, well, what's the political situation? I think he could rather rapidly orient himself. He would say, well, what happened in the Soviet Union? I said, well, you know, it was dissolved in 1991, as you predicted, and the revolution betrayed. He said, what was the, you know, he would very rapidly understand the political situation. I mean, terms such as the death agony of capitalism, world socialist revolution, the globalization of the class struggle, the bankruptcy of the bourgeois nation state. These are terms which are eminently applicable to our own time. But let me illustrate this point. We're now dealing with the war in Ukraine. Now, what would Trotsky have to say about this? Well, as it turns out, actually, I included in this collection is rather brief essay I wrote last August to commemorate the 82nd anniversary of the assassination of Trotsky, which is titled Trotsky and the Self-Determination of Ukraine. And I called attention to what Trotsky wrote on the question of Ukraine in 1939, during the final year of his life. And he said the following, and this is just a few months before the outbreak of the Second World War. He said, the Ukraine question is destined in the immediate future to play an enormous role in the life of Europe. It is not for nothing that Hitler so noisily raised the question of creating a greater Ukraine, and likewise it was not for nothing that he dropped the question with such stealthy haste. He then, and I'll just read a passage as I connect various paragraphs. I wrote, Trotsky recognized the legitimacy of the striving of the Ukrainian masses for national self-determination. The formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics by the Bolshevik government in 1922, when Lenin and Trotsky were still the dominant figures, insisted on the voluntary character of the Union and opposed all tendencies to subordinate its Ukrainian component to the pressure of Great Russian chauvinism. The Declaration of Union and Treaty of Union, dated December 30th, 1922, defined the USSR as, quote, a voluntary union of equal peoples, unquote, whose formation would prove, quote, a decided step toward the union of the workers of all countries in a world socialist Soviet federation, unquote. But by the late 1930s, 15 years of escalating violations of socialist internationalism and bureaucratic terror and despotism had generated deep hostility among the Ukrainian masses toward the Soviet Union and created a constituency for the revival of the most reactionary political tendencies. Trotsky wrote, and again I'm quoting Trotsky's from March 1939, not a trace remains of the former confidence and sympathy of the Western Ukrainian masses for the Kremlin. Since the latest murderous purge in the Kremlin, in the Ukraine, no one in the West wants to become part of the Kremlin satrapy, which continues to bear the name of the Soviet Ukraine. The worker and peasant masses in Western Ukraine, in Bukovina, and the Carpatho-Ukraine are in a state of confusion. Where to turn, what to demand. This situation naturally shifts the leadership to the most reactionary Ukrainian cliques who express their so-called nationalism by seeking to sell the Ukrainian people to one imperialism or another in return for the promise of fictitious independence. Upon this tragic confusion, Hitler bases his policy in the Ukrainian question. At one time we said, but for Stalin, but for the fatal policy of the Comintern in Germany, there would have been no Hitler. To this now can be added, but for the rape of Soviet Ukraine by the Stalinist bureaucracy, there would be no Hitlerite Ukrainian policy. Now, changing what has to be changed. The policy of contemporary imperialism, of Biden, of British imperialism, the Australian bourgeoisie, all the other members of NATO and its different instruments and agencies build their policy on the completely bankrupt policies of Putin, who is himself a legacy of the tragic and reactionary policies of Stalinism. And Trotsky's analysis remains to this day a basic guide for understanding the processes which are presently at work. I must say, in one of the essays here, I spoke in Kiev in 1991, just 2 months before the dissolution of the USSR, and specifically addressed the question of Ukrainian nationalism and warned that one of the consequences of the dissolution of the Soviet Union would be almost inevitably the outbreak of fratricidal struggle between Ukrainians and Russians. And this is what has happened. Now, there's another point I'd like to raise about the book, and it goes to the significance of Trotskyism and Trotsky's role. There's an old saying, books have their own fate. The first set of essays that appear in this book were written in October 1982. And strangely enough, when I began writing what became an extended series of articles, I actually began with the intention of simply writing a tribute to a member of the Workers' League who had been assassinated in 1977, Tom Heenahan. It was the 5th anniversary of his assassination. And I set out initially to pay tribute to his memory. But in the course of writing it, my attention turned to the question of how did a young man like Tom Heenahan become a cadre in our movement? On what basis was he educated? How was he trained? And it so happened at that very time, it was becoming increasingly clear that the dominant section within the International Committee, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, was moving very far from its Trotskyist moorings, that many of the principles upon which, the principles for which it had fought in the struggle against Pavlovism were being abandoned. And as an element of this, while tribute was paid to Trotsky, there were meetings held to honor the memory of Trotsky, more and more it was being suggested that somehow Trotsky was old hat, that it was not, that Trotskyism, the political lessons of Trotskyism were not the basis for the training of cadre, the great historical experience which he had analyzed, but a very abstract, distorted, and essentially idealist falsification of Marxism was being substituted. And I was particularly incensed by the suggestion that somehow the basis of cadre education involved an incantation of Hegelian phraseology, a falsification of the relationship of Marxism to dialectical philosophy, and in which Trotsky had very little to say. So in the course of writing, and this happens, my attention turned to the historical development of Trotsky and the manner in which it was in the works of Trotsky that we could understand the relationship of Marxism to the struggles of the working class, which is the real concern of Marxism. Yes, it is true that Marxism can be described as a world scientific outlook, but what is of particular concern to Marxists, to genuine Marxists, is how the great opus and scientific work of Marx and Engels relate to the fundamental problem of the conquest of power by the working class. We are not academicians. We are concerned with coming to grips with the fact that unless there is a socialist revolution, the world is doomed. And the only force which can carry through this revolution is the working class. That is the central truth which must be assimilated and understood by everyone who considers himself or herself a Marxist. And of course, it is in the work of Trotsky and in Lenin, but Trotsky in the aftermath of Lenin's death, that the powerful methodology of Marxism, of historical materialist analysis, is applied to provide an answer to the great political problems and questions of our time. And this is what this book is concerned with. If nothing else, I'm going to put it somewhat different. I've obviously written a great deal about Trotsky. Many of the articles which I've written about Trotsky have inevitably been concerned with defending Trotsky. I once said in jest, I feel like at times like a lawyer who has just one client. I have been compelled again and again to respond to lies told about Leon Trotsky. Now, in this very fact, there is as well a great contemporary significance. Why are the lies about Trotsky so persistent? Even now, for example, in the United States, the Democratic, so-called Democratic Socialists, which is an agency of the Democratic Party, which feels increasing pressure from the World Socialist website and the influence of the International Committee, it has a whole faction which tends to respond to the critiques of the ICFI and the World Socialist website by posting ice picks in their denunciations of our movement. Why this visceral hatred of Trotsky? More than any other figure, why is this figure so, why does he provoke such rage? And the answer is because discussions about Trotsky are never just discussions about the past. They always tend to be discussions about the present. It's not just about how, I don't know, like to use just, it's not only about your assessment of the October Revolution. It's about how you view the world today. The politics which are required to establish the political independence of the working class, or to base the socialist movement, or what is called socialism, on the class struggle of the working class and the perspective of world socialism. So, of course, the historical questions are always uppermost, and I've had to address them again and again. But this other element of Trotsky is of decisive importance. And this is what this book is concerned with. It establishes that it is Trotskyism, which is the form of socialism, at least as that term would have been understood by Marx, Engels, and Lenin himself, and Rosa Luxemburg. All those who understood Marxism to be most decisively the means of arming the working class for the struggle against capitalism and its revolutionary overthrow and the victory of world socialism. So this is what the essays in this book are really concerned with, establishing again and again the connection between historical experience and present-day tasks, that it's only in the development of this movement that one has the expression of the contemporary development of Marxism and the revolutionary organization of the working class. So I hope that this book will contribute to the rearming of the working class. I'll just conclude by saying we are witnessing a profound change. We are in a revolutionary crisis. I said to Comrade Nick yesterday, Comrade Nick Beams has written a great deal on the crisis of capitalism. And I said yesterday, well, we've really won that argument. Anyone who doesn't believe there's a crisis of capitalism is, has lost virtually all capacity for sensory perception, let alone thought. That argument has been won. The question is the following, and if I can pose this in the sharpest way possible. The Ukraine war is not going away. This war is metastasizing into a struggle, into a conflict of ever greater dimensions. It is the opening episodes of what will soon be clear to be a world war. It has the most dangerous implications. And the historical situation in which we find ourselves presents itself as follows. What will develop more rapidly? The drive of the ruling elites with their recklessness toward a catastrophe, their response to a global crisis for which they have no rational answer. One can look at their policy and say, well, don't they realize this could result in a nuclear war? This is insane. And it's true, it is insane. But even when we talk about insane policies, Hitler was insane, but the insanity of Hitler can be explained materialistically and historically in the objective contradictions of German capitalism. Biden is not insane in the sense that Hitler is insane. He may be senile. He's not insane. And yet he's pursuing, along with Macron and all the others, your Albanese here in Australia, policies which in their logical unfolding lead to a cataclysm. I mean, no one can possibly believe that a war with China is just what Australia needs. But we understand that all we can infer from this is that their actions are a response to contradictions which have closed off rational responses. Again, I was mentioning a book I've been reading about the beginning of the First World War, an excellent book called Pandora's Box. And the question that the historian raises about the origins of the First World War is that there had been a whole series of previous sharp crises, and each time there was an intervention to prevent these crises from acquiring an all-European global dimension. But in 1914, that didn't happen. All the decisions ultimately were made for war, with its cataclysmic consequences for all of Europe and all the world. Now we can understand the deeper roots of that process, which the Marxists explain more profoundly than anyone else in Lenin's imperialism, in Trotsky's war in the international, the crisis of the nation-state system, and so on. So now we see this crisis unfolding, and if we can recognize the enormous scale and the enormous dangers, and they are very real. Why are they doing this? Well, you have to look at the implications of the striving of the United States for hegemony, the relationship of hegemony to the defense of the role of the dollar, which is the basis of America's global role, the fear that the emergence of substantial competitors will undermine dollar supremacy and therefore the world role of the United States and its shattering implications within the United States itself for social relationships. So that's what drives this crisis. What is the alternative? Well, as I said, there are two processes at work. There is the processes which lead through the contradictions of capitalism to devastating war and cataclysm. But those very contradictions also produce social revolution. And if one can look at the present situation, and here is a very significant difference, one might even say, to 1914. Alongside in 1914, the war took everyone unawares in a sense. They weren't prepared. And there was a period of about 2 years of almost death-like stillness in the midst of the horrifying battles of Verdun, Somme, Ypres, thousands of people being mowed down each day on the Western Front, and also in the East. And then the confusion and disorientation produced by the betrayals of the social democracy began to dissipate, and there was a revolutionary reorganization of the working class, which found its highest expression in the very rapid rise of Bolshevism in 1917 with its world implications. What we already see, and yes, I'm not making a direct comparison, but one element which is really striking, we are already witnessing on a world scale a huge development of class struggle. The ruling elites are waging a two-front war against Russia, against China, but also against our own working classes. Macron in France is at war with the French people. The British Tories and their social democratic labor right allies are at war against the working class in Britain. The American ruling class simply will not tolerate even the most limited forms of class action by the working class, which is being radicalized. And that process is really sweeping throughout the world. And keep in mind that we live in a world, and this is perhaps the greatest verification of Trotsky's political perspective and vision. The battalions of the working class today are far larger and far greater than that which was available to the Bolsheviks and to the Fourth International in the 1930s or the 1940s. The African continent is witnessing the emergence of proletarian centers in urban areas which have populations of 20, 30, even 40 million by the end of this decade. Latin America, cities such as Sao Paulo, with its vast proletariat, the possibilities objectively for social revolution are greater than at any time in world history. And that social revolution, the perspective that will guide that revolution, will be found in that movement which bases itself, yes, on the whole historical legacy of Marxism, but above all, it will be identified with the figure of Leon Trotsky. And that is what the International Committee of the Fourth International represents, and which all of you, those of you who are not members of our movement, should join and strive to build. We are in a new epoch of social revolution, and it's to that which this book is essentially dedicated. Thank you very much, comrades.